You mentioned Medellin. By the way, how do you pronounce it? Medellin or Medellin?
Both are fine. I think there they'd say Medellin because that's kind of the accent is the just on the double L, but Medellin would be totally fine as well.
What lessons do you draw from the Medellin Cartel, from the different gang wars in Colombia and Medellin? What's the economics of peace and war between drug cartels?
Here's what was really insightful for me. So I live in Chicago, and Chicago people are aware that there's a violence problem in Chicago. It's actually not the worst American city by any stretch of the imagination for shootings, but it's pretty bad. And Medellin has these many more, and probably many better organized gangs than Chicago, and yet the homicide rate is maybe half. Um, and Now, I mean, there have been moments when these gangs go to war in the last 30 years when Medellin has become the most violent place on the planet. But for the most part, right now, they're peaceful. And so what's going on there? I mean, one thing that is there's a hierarchy of organizations, so that above these reasonably well-organized neighborhood gangs, there's a set of sort of more shadowy organizations that have different names. Some people call them razones. Some people would call them bandas criminales, criminal bands. You might just call them mafias. And there's about 17 of them, depending on how you want to count. And they themselves have a little operating board sometimes they call it the office, la oficina. Sometimes they call it la mesa, the table.
Well, each individual one or as a group?
As a group. So they meet, and they don't meet personally all the time. Sometimes they meet, but they consult. A lot of the leaders of these groups are actually in prison. And they're in the same wings in prison.
Do they have represented? Oh, they meet in prison.
Well, they're whatever. If I'm on a cell block with you, I'm meeting you anyways, right? And so actually imprisoning leaders and putting them in the same cell block, but not putting them in, if you get arrested here in the United States and you're a criminal leader and you get put in a supermax prison, you cannot run your criminal empire. It's just too difficult. It's impossible. There, it's possible. And you might think, and they do, they still run their empire. And you might think that's a bad idea, but actually cutting off the head of a criminal organization, leaving it to a bunch of like hot-headed young guys who are disorganized is not always the path to peace. So having these guys all in the same prison patios is actually, it reduces imperfect information and uncertainty, right? It provides a place for them to bargain. They can talk. And so La Oficina is like a lot of these informal meetings. And so, and they have these tools that they use to control the street gangs. So instead of there being like 400 gangs, all sort of in this anarchic situation of competing for territory and constantly at war, the razones are keeping them in line. And they will use sanctions. Sanction might be, I will put a bullet in your head if you
Right.
If you don't,
it's a little more honest than the sanctions between nations.
Yeah. Exactly. But they will sit them down. They'll help them negotiate. They will provide I said there are these things called commitment problems where like there's some I have some incentive to like exterminate you, but that's going to be costly for everybody. So what's the solution? Well, I'm going to provide commitment. I'm going to like enforce this deal. And yeah, you don't like this deal now because you could take advantage of your situation and wage war, but I'm going to give you a counter incentives. And so they keep the peace. And it's a little bit, so they're a little bit like the UN Security Council and peacekeeping forces and sanctions regimes. It's like the same kinds of tools, the same parallels, and they're imperfect. They don't always work that well, and they're unequal, right? Because it's not like they're pursuing this in the interests of like democratic blah, blah, blah. But it kind of works until it doesn't. And 10 years ago in the mid 1990s, there were wars and this breaks down. And it kind of gave me this perspective on the international institutions and all the tools we've built, that we do the same things, right? Sanctions are designed to make unchecked leaders face the cost of war. It's a solution to one of the 5 problems, right? And mediators are a solution to uncertainty. And international institutions that can enforce a peace and agreement are a solution to commitment problems. And all of these things can be solutions to these intangible incentives, like these preferences for whatever you value, and miscalculations, because they will punish you for your miscalculation, or they will get a mediator to sort of help you realize why you're miscalculating. So they're doing all these things, and it made me realize that the comparison to the UN Security Council and all our tools is actually a pretty good one, because those are pretty unequal too. And those are pretty imperfect. Like that's, we have 5 nations with a veto on the Security Council and a lot of unequal power, and they're manipulating this in their own self-interest or their group's interests. So anyway, so it's actually some of the things that work in Medellin and why they work help give me a lot of perspective on what works in the international arena and why we have some of the problems we have. Is like,
So there's not, in some deep way, there's not a fundamental difference between those 17 mafia groups and
the UN Security Council.
The UN Security Council. We're such
like,
funny descendant of apes. We put on suits. I'm sure they have different cultural garbs that they wear.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? I mean, that's the sense I got from Pablo Escobar and Jorge Ochoa, who founded the Medellin Cartel. Is like having spoken with people on this podcast, talked to Roger Reeves, who was a drug transporter. It seems like it was I don't know the right term, but it was very kind of professional and calm. It didn't have a sense of danger to it, like it's negotiating. So like the danger is always on the table as a threat, as part of the calculation, but you're using that threat in order to de-escalate, in order to have peace. Yeah. Everybody is interested in peace.
So something that happened last year, we were a little bit able to watch in real time because we had a few contacts. We've been meeting and talking to a lot of these leaders in prison and a bit outside of prison. Many of them will talk to us. And so the homicide, I mentioned the homicide rate in Medellin's maybe 2/3 or half of the Chicago level. It had been climbing. Some of these street level gangs were starting to fight. Maybe at sort of on some level, it seems that like maybe some of those Razón leaders were like saying, well, we're actually not sure how strong these guys are. Let's let them fight just to test it out. Let's have these skirmishes, right? It wasn't prolonged warfare. It was like, let's just sort of feel out how strong everybody is, because then we'll be able to reapportion the drug corners and stuff accordingly. So they were kind of feeling each other out through fighting. And the homicide rate doubled, and then it increased by the same amount again. And so it was approaching something that might get out of control, which wasn't in anybody's interest. It wasn't in the government's interest, wasn't in their interest. And so then magically, all these leaders on these patios, right? Different prisons, they're spread out around a bunch of prisons. Everybody gets transferred to a new prison on the same day, which means they all get to be in the same holding area for 3 days before they're all moved elsewhere. So the government had a role in this. And then somebody who's like a trusted mediator on the criminal side gets himself arrested and happens to be put in the same spot. And a week later, the homicide rate is 30% of what it was. It's back to its normal moderate, unfortunately not zero, right? But it's back to where it was because it didn't make sense to have a war. And everybody, government, mafia leaders, everybody sort of like, they figured out a way to sort of bargain their way to peace.